Thank you and welcome back, everyone. I'm Melissa Fleming and I'm Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. Along with Dr. Obi Ezek-Wasili, I have the pleasure to be one of the co-chairs for Session 2, Equality in Leadership. As we saw and heard in the previous session, if we want a new normal after the COVID-19 pandemic, then we will need a new transformational kind of leadership. We will also require equal leadership and representation. The new normal must mean an end to the current dramatic gender imbalance in leadership. So how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be when it comes to equality in leadership? To help us answer that today, we are joined by 7 distinguished panelists from around the world. They are Delphine O, Ambassador at Large, France, and Secretary General for the Generation Equality Forum. Galina Karolova, Deputy Speaker of the Federation Council and WPL Country Ambassador, Russian Federation. Hafsat Abiola, President of Women in Africa, founder of the Kudarat Initiative for Democracy, WPL Special Envoy to Africa. Julie Gerberding, Executive Vice President and Chief Patient Officer at MSD. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, former President of the Republic of Croatia, WPL Global Ambassador for Vaccination. Tabata Amaral, member of the Chamber of Deputies, Brazil, WPL Country Ambassador. Wafa Bani Mustafa, chairperson of the Coalition of Women MPs from Arab Countries to Combat Violence Against Women, former member of the Jordanian Parliament, WPL Special Envoy to Arabia. Before we hear from these panelists, I would like to hand over to my co-chair, Dr. Obi Ezek-Wasili, a Senior Economic Advisor for Africa Economic Policy Initiative, AEDPI, and a former World Bank Vice President. Over to you, Dr. Obi.
Thank you so very much, Melissa. What a delight to be at this year's summit and to welcome our incredible cast of speakers for session 2 on equality in leadership. I am definitely looking forward to the conversation we will have with very incredible women who have done great work and are speaking from experience as well as from a passion for the kind of change that we must have. The post-COVID era is an era of opportunity. Whatever regression we suffered in attaining the goals of equality over this last year and a half can quickly be closed. And we can reverse the regression by doing the critical things that WPL has been advocating for. We can do a lot within a year to close the gap in economic leadership, in political leadership, in leadership within society at large. We are looking forward to more actors in the space of equality, really achieving concrete results. And that starts with this conversation today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you. Now let's kick things off. The question for all of our panelists today is the same. What concrete actions and commitments are needed to achieve equal participation in leadership and more women in power? And how do we ensure change across all sectors? First up is Delphine O, who is Ambassador at Large for France and Secretary General for the Generation Equality Forum. Over to you, Delphine.
I believe there are 2 things needed in order to increase the number of women in leadership positions. The first thing is that we need to facilitate the accession of women for leadership positions. And for that, there's no magic recipe. We know that the pace of Gender equality is too slow. It will take over 200 years to reach full gender equality. So what we need is new legislation. And for that, we need organizations such as Women Political Leaders that will help gather women politicians and drive a new legislation and new constraints in national settings in order to put quotas for women in leadership, both in the public and in the private sector. The second thing we need is, in order not just to facilitate, but actually to drive young women to leadership position, is inspiring role models. It's very important that young women who are growing up in today's world can see women in positions of power, either in the public or in the private sector, in the media, and in very powerful positions. And for that, we need a new faces, we need inspiring faces, we need powerful faces in the media, in politics, in the private sector, and in across all sectors in very powerful positions. If we combine these two things, constraining legislation with new role models coming up and being an inspiration for young women with youth engagement, I do hope that we can have more women in leadership position in the future.
Wow, thank you so very much, Delphine. Such powerful points you have laid on. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Galina Karelova, Deputy Speaker of the Federation Council and WPL Country Ambassador, Russian Federation. Over to you, Galina.
Уважаемые коллеги, на уровне высшего руководства нашей страны есть четкое понимание необходимости создания условий для профессионального и личностного развития женщин, повышения их экономической активности и продвижения на уровень принятия решений. Так, в Совете Федерации создан постоянно действующий Совет по продвижению проектов и программ в интересах женщин, председателем которого мне выпала честь являться. Наш Совет – это партнерство государства, бизнеса, некоммерческого сектора. Взаимодействие на одной площадке представителей различных структур позволяет эффективно решать многие вопросы, выбирать наиболее приоритетные проекты. 22 проекта Совета уже есть, они направлены на расширение участия женщин в промышленности, инновациях, развитие женского предпринимательства. Один из таких проектов – образовательная программа «Женщина-лидер», направленная на повышение управленческих компетенций женщин. С сентября 2020 года более 300 женщин из разных регионов России прошли обучение, разработали более 50 социально значимых инициатив. Этим же целям отвечает проводимый Советом конкурс среди государственных и коммерческих организаций по созданию эффективных социальных лифтов для женщин. В рамках конкурса оцениваются практики по созданию равных возможностей мужчин и женщин при найме на работу, включение в кадровый резерв, назначение на управленческие позиции. Отмечу, что в России реализуется целый ряд различных проектов по отбору талантливых и перспективных людей, созданию условий для их карьерного и профессионального роста. «Лидеры России» – один из таких проектов. Он дает возможность молодым людям реализовать свой потенциал, независимо от места их проживания. Он создает реальные социальные лифты. Победители конкурса получают возможность занять места топ-менеджеров в корпоративных и государственных структурах. Уважаемые коллеги, в современном мире преодоление последствий пандемии возможно только в условиях международного сотрудничества. При участии женщин-лидеров среди наших международных проектов Женский деловой альянс БРИКС, Международный конкурс женских предпринимательских проектов «Экономик стран АТЭС», тематический проект ориентированный на поддержку женского лидерства и предпринимательства, реализуемый с Организацией Объединенных Наций по промышленному развитию. И наша общая задача – обеспечить для женщин необходимые условия воплощения в жизнь их намерений, используя как уже сложившийся собственный опыт, так и успешные механизмы и проекты наших партнеров.
Thank you, Ms. Karalova, for that thoughtful contribution. Next up is Hafsat Abiola, President of Women in Africa, founder of the Kudirat Initiative for Democracy, and WPL Special Envoy to Africa.
I studied economics in my undergraduate university, and so allow me to just approach this as a demand and supply problem. On the demand side, there has to be a demand for women leaders in companies, in the corporate, in the economy, and also in the political world. Yet we see that there isn't that. In the corporate world, we find that companies often measure all employees as if they were men. And men employees are very different in their performance and in their behavior than women. Consider that when a male employee sees a job opportunity, if he gets 30% of what is required for that job, he applies. Whereas for women, if they see a job opportunity, even if they have 70% of the qualifications, they feel that they don't have a good chance. If women are risk averse and men are risk prone in terms of seeking bigger opportunities, then companies should take that into account. But companies treat the behavior of male employees as the default behavior of all employees, and don't do enough to take into account that qualified women are not stepping forward and should be encouraged in a particular way, which is unfortunate for companies because all the studies that we've seen show that it's with increased diversity that companies do better. We see the similar research also when we study politics, people in politics. For example, Women Political Leaders does an annual survey called the Reykjavik Index on Leadership, which they do with Cantor. And they, in this study, are able to show that people actually have a default perception that that leadership is male. And so if there's a default perception that leadership is male, they're not going to be thinking of women when they think of leaders. And if they had to choose between male and female candidates, well, they may not even notice the qualities and the qualifications of the female candidates and just default and choose the male candidate. So laws again would make a difference. And we've seen this because in that same study, they researched in depth 2 countries in Africa, Kenya and Nigeria, and found that Nigeria is actually more progressive in the perception of leadership as being both male and female. And yet Kenya has over 20% of women in public office, whereas in Nigeria it's less than 10%, because in Kenya there's an affirmative action law that makes it mandatory that political parties give women candidates the possibility of running for office in proportion to the male candidates. As an African, I'm especially keen to see that minority communities and people from the continent of Africa and from the developing world are also represented in global leadership positions. Women Political Leaders works on this. So in the end, I'd like to ask you, if you're not already working with women political leaders, if you're not already partnering, supporting in some way, join us, because we are working to make the world that you deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafsat, for those interesting points. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Julie Gabardine, EVP and Chief Patient Officer of MSD. Take it away, Julie.
We're coming out of a tragic pandemic. And of course, it's not over yet, but when we do emerge, we have to choose to be different than we've been going into this pandemic. And I think from the health perspective, there are a few really critical things that we have to pay attention to. First and foremost is the whole global health equity challenge. The pandemic has made that crystal clear to everyone. And as leaders, we need to step forward to make sure that health equity and gender equity go hand in hand. It's the mom effect. And we know that if women's health suffers, family health suffers, and that leads to a lot of other downstream consequences that detract from the overall quality of life in individuals, families, and communities. But the second thing we need to pay attention to is how do we help people restore good health coming out of the pandemic? We see women disproportionately missing their primary care services, and they're missing their maternal care services. So we have to challenge ourselves to step forward in an affirmative way and make sure that women catch up with their own health, because many of them have been busy taking care of the health of others. So they haven't had their screenings for cancer. They haven't had their vaccinations. They haven't participated in their family planning and their reproductive health services. So being ambassadors and advocates for women to return to care and get the care that they need. And then finally, I think because women are disproportionately involved in the caring and healthcare services, we need to remember that caring and healthcare are gender issues, and we must advocate for a better status for our health providers and our care providers and make sure that they have the training and the personal protective equipment and the security going forward, so that they do not have to step forward on the front lines of healthcare service delivery and put their own lives at risk.
Thank you, Julie, for those insights. Now we can hear from Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, former president of the Republic of Croatia and WPL Global Ambassador for Vaccination.
Dear colleagues and friends, when I was first elected president of Croatia, I proudly stressed around the world of Croatia's having elected the first female president in a direct election as an important step in achieving gender equality. However, soon did I realize that neither our public nor most of the world is ready for a female leader. I had to face many stereotypes and barriers that women typically encounter at the top of their political career. Women in leadership are still looked at different pair of lenses or spectacles that seem to distort the vision by sharpening the physical features and blurring the professional capacities. The first news of any event that I did, most of the time, was my clothes or my hairstyle. There were bikini photos that were not me, but claimed to be me, posted all over the internet. Focusing on feminine characteristics, focusing on appearances, sends a message that women are mostly decoration. That is just another way how they will try to reduce you to a frivolous, inconsequential, unimportant object. Now, as an independent member of the IOC, I often stress that sport is one of the most powerful platforms for promoting gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. In sport, the heroes are real, as opposed to fictional characters, and it shows that hard work pays off. The IOC has made great progress in promoting gender equality, offering leadership development, advocacy, and awareness campaigns, and more recently appointing more women to leadership roles within the administration and government. Tokyo will be the first ever gender-balanced Olympic Games in history, with almost 49 female participants, and full parity will be achieved in Paris and Los Angeles. We all agree that we have made great strides. However, problems persist, and if we want to achieve SDG number 5, gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls, we all need to work stronger together. First of all, support your female colleagues. Acknowledge their ideas and contribution. Too often, women are more brutal in their discriminatory approach to women than men. Too often do we perceive each other as competition instead of an opportunity to create our own legacy. When in a position of power, make sure that you yourself achieve gender balance on your team. Propose female candidates for other positions when you're in a position to do so, based on their merit, in order to create a pool of talented women from which to draw. Secondly, fight stereotypes. Resist the notion of what is appropriate for girls and what is appropriate for boys. Educate, persist, and prove the point that there will be persons around the decision-making table who may look, dress, or talk in a different way than men, but that does not mean that it makes them any less capable. We need a real action. Diversity around the decision-making table should be the new normal. We need action that inspires to follow positive examples. And if you want to lead by example, you have to be prepared to stand with women and men in uniform on the ground in the hot sun of Afghanistan and in the pouring rain with your countrymen at the World Cup, where it was more than clear that looks really did not matter to me. Regardless of stereotypes, there is nothing women cannot do if they set their mind to it. Leaders are not born, they're made through time, through personal growth, shaped by personal, environmental, and professional experiences. And finally, let us all work a lot closer together. Women political leaders across the globe face many of the same challenges: misogyny, sexism, lack of funding. Having a network like women political leaders to lean on for support, information, and connections is a big help. Together, we're stronger.
We're very delighted to have our next speaker, Tabata Amaral, a member of the Chamber of Deputies and WPL ambassador for Brazil. Tabata, you're on.
Hello everyone, my name is Tabata Amaral. I'm an education activist and a federal deputy representing the state of São Paulo in the Brazilian National Congress. I will now speak in Portuguese. A pandemia vem expondo e aprofundando nossas muitas desigualdades, mas ela deixou um aprendizado importante. Nós vimos que países liderados por mulheres tiveram um desempenho muito melhor, não apenas econômico, mas também no combate à pandemia. E isso para mim não foi nenhuma surpresa. Quantos estudos nos mostram, já há muitos anos, que mulheres no poder fazem bem a toda a sociedade, homens e mulheres, porque de acordo com esses estudos, as mulheres têm uma forma mais colaborativa de trabalhar. E justamente por isso e por outras razões, melhoram os índices de combate à corrupção, de desempenho econômico, desempenho educacional, social, entre tantos outros. E aqui eu gostaria de falar como deputada federal, mas também como embaixadora brasileira do Women Political Leaders. Foi justamente por saber que mais mulheres no poder fazem bem a toda a sociedade, mas também por viver em um país que ainda é extremamente machista, que é o 5º país que mais mata mulheres em crimes de ódio e que tem apenas 15% do Congresso Nacional representando as mulheres, que no ano passado eu criei o Instituto Vamos Juntas, que apoiou 51 candidatas nas eleições municipais, das quais 11 foram eleitas. E nas eleições do próximo ano, nós queremos apoiar 400 mulheres. No Congresso, para além do meu trabalho com Vamos Juntas, eu tenho muito orgulho de participar da bancada feminina, que vem trazendo avanços muito importantes na defesa da reserva de cadeiras em todos os legislativos, nacional, estaduais e municipais, mas também na defesa de projetos que eu tive a honra de apresentar, que prezam por incentivos financeiros para que os partidos políticos tenham de fato incentivos para eleger mais mulheres, que trazem diretrizes para maior inclusão de mulheres na direção dos partidos políticos e também, falando do trabalho dessa bancada que tanto me honra, dos inúmeros projetos que nós aprovamos no último ano, tipificando a violência política de gênero e combatendo a violência doméstica, entre tantas outras formas de preconceito, exclusão e violência. Como ativista pela educação, eu sei que é apenas pela educação que nós vamos transformar o nosso mundo e fazer do nosso país um país mais justo, desenvolvido e ético. E aqui eu queria trazer uma frase que muito me inspira e que também vem de estudos que já foram feitos. Com mulheres no poder, meninas voltam a sonhar e têm sonhos maiores. E é por isso que representatividade importa tanto. Apesar da nossa luta ser muito dura e ainda muito marcada pela violência aqui no Brasil, eu tenho certeza que não há luta mais nobre do que essa, porque no final do dia, o que nós estamos fazendo é lutar para que nossas crianças, meninos e meninas, possam sonhar sem limites e saibam que o lugar deles, o lugar delas, é exatamente onde eles quiserem, onde elas quiserem, independente de qualquer fator. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Tabata, for that spirited message. Finally, it's the turn of Wafa Bani Mustafa. Wafa is chairperson of the Coalition of Women MPs from Arab Countries to Combat Violence Against Women, a former member of the Jordanian Public, and a WPL Special Envoy to Arabia. Over to you.
إنه من دواعي سروري واعتزازي أن أشارككم اليوم هذه الجلسة وانطلاقا من إيماني بأن المساواة في القيادة لابد أن تتطلب مساواة كاملة في المواطنة وفي الحقوق والواجبات. أعتقد بأنه من المهم جدا التركيز على عدد من الأمور. الأول هو أن يكون هنالك إلغاء كامل لكافة أشكال التشريعات والقوانين التمييزية ضد النساء، ليس فقط في السياسة وإنما أيضا في الحياة الشخصية وفي العمل وفي المجالات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، فهذه كلها تؤثر على تمكين النساء. الأمر الثاني المهم والأساسي هو أن تكون التشريعات السياسية تشريعات تسمح بوصول النساء وصديقة للنساء، وأن تكون الأنظمة الانتخابية تضمن وصول النساء من خلال حصص ومقاعد مخصصة للنساء على المستويات المحلية وعلى المستويات الوطنية، وهذا أمر غاية في الأهمية، ولا بد أن يكون هنالك بالأقل نسبة لا تقل عن 30% داخل البرلمانات الوطنية للنساء ككوتا. الأمر الثاني أو الثالث وهو أهمية وجود سياسة وتفعيلها باتجاه محاربة كافة أشكال العنف ضد النساء، لأن كافة أشكال العنف تعتبر أحد الأشكال التي تمنع النساء من الوصول إلى القيادة المتساوية، وبالتحديد العنف السياسي. ونحن في ائتلاف البرلمانيات العربية قدمنا مشروعا لاتفاقية عربية، وكان من أهم المحاور التي ركزنا عليها محور العنف والتمييز السياسي، وأيضا أطلقنا دليل بالتعاون مع المعهد الديمقراطي الوطني وهو الأول من نوعه في المنطقة. هذا الدليل كان يتكلم عن كيف يمكن للنساء أن يحمين أنفسهن من التعرض للعنف السياسي وكيف التعامل مع حالات العنف السياسي، وهذا الدليل متوفر بالعربية وبالإنجليزية ويمكن لنا أن نشارككم إياه. الأمر الرابع هو يجب التركيز على الأحزاب والآليات داخل الأحزاب، ويجب أن يكون هنالك آليات تضمن مشاركة عادلة ومتساوية للنساء في الأحزاب، وأن لا يبقى إشراك النساء في داخل الأحزاب إشراكا شكليا. أخيرا من المهم في بلدي الأردن، وهذه نقطة غاية في الأهمية، أن يكون هنالك طريقة من أجل مساعدة النساء لتمويل حملاتهم الانتخابية ولحشد الموارد لحملاتهم الانتخابية، وهذا أمر مهم جدا حيث الاستثمار بالنساء من قبل الأحزاب والفاعلين السياسيين يكون أقل، وبالضرورة أن يترافق مع ذلك آليات واضحة لمحاربة استخدام المال الأسود في السياسة. أعتقد أنه من المهم جدا أن يكون هنالك نظرة حقيقية إلى أن وجود النساء في السياسة هو مصلحة كبيرة وأساسية للمجتمعات، مصلحة أساسية وكبيرة للنساء ولكافة الفئات المهمشة بالمجتمع، واستطعت أن أعي ذلك وأن أشارك فيه من خلال قيامي بمجهودات خلال مدة 10 سنوات من خدمتي في البرلمان من أجل مثلا تعديل قانون العقوبات الأردني الذي استطعنا بجهود وطنية شملت مؤسسات المجتمع المدني وشملت الإعلام من إلغاء المادة 308 التي كانت تعتبر وتسمح بإفلات مرتكبي الجرائم الجنسية من العقاب. استطعنا أن نجرم كافة أشكال التحرش بالنساء. استطعنا أن يكون ونفتح ملفات كانت تعتبر تابوهات لا يستطيع أحد التحدث عنها، مثل ملف أبناء الأردنيات، واستطعنا أن نحصل لهم على عدد من الحقوق المدنية في قطاعات مهمة. وجود النساء مهم ورؤية النساء مهمة. لا يمكن أن يكون القرار السياسي كاملا إذا لم تكن النساء جزءا أساسيا منه. شكرا لكم.
Wow, Wafa, thank you. What a powerful close to the discussion by our panelists. Well, dear friends, it's been an amazing panel conversation around achieving equal leadership. I think that it is clear from all we've heard from these leaders of countries, whether in parliament or in executive arm of government or in private sector, that this is the moment. This post-COVID recovery cannot be complete without the matter of equal leadership of men and women being at the top of the global agenda, as well as the public agenda for all countries. That's my number one takeaway. We must keep at this. Nothing should make us stop. My number two is that the role of legislation and policies, right policies that promote the closure of the gaps between men and women in leadership, found a lot of resonance amongst our speakers. This is so important. It's important because we can't leave the idea of achieving equality to the whims and caprices who's come into government at different times. The more that we can have legislation, especially legislations that are enforced, implemented to the letter, the better for us in closing the gaps. We heard that from a lot of our women. And some legislations are, intended to achieve, but because of the way that they have been crafted, they become stumbling blocks. We need to do legislative reforms, even on in some of the countries where legislations exist. And we need to therefore find noxious legislations that contradict new legislations to aid the emergence of women in leadership. The third thing for me is the role that women who are already in leadership have to play. In other words, taking responsibility for this agenda. One of the things that we heard clearly is the necessity for women to practice what we campaign for. So those of us that have emerged as leaders must reflect gender balance in the way that we constitute or compose our teams. It's crucial. That role modeling means that we are not hypocritical, asking others to do what we are not yet practicing. So take responsibility is one major thing that we all must do. And that's where I respect the experience that Wafa shared with us. She took responsibility, worked with civil society, achieved the amendment of a legislation that was inimical to the freedom of women, a legislation that promoted impunity in sexual crimes was not acceptable. And she rose up to the task as a parliamentarian and made it happen. The more that we see such examples, the better for us. And so for those women who are already in position of leadership, we carry a burden. The heavy lifting must be done by every one of us. Legislation, policy changes, advocacies, making sure that public-private partnerships, collaborations, and cooperations happen across countries, within countries, globally. It's our duty, it's our responsibility. And I am so excited that post-COVID era would see WPL even double up more the great work that it already does in making the leadership by men and women a normal in a post-COVID normal. Thank you very much. And I look forward to interacting with you another time. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Dr. Obi. Now it's time to hand over to the co-chairs of the next session, Deanne Kita, who is Deputy Executive Director for Programs at the UN Population Fund, and Hannah Birna Christiansdottir, a Senior Advisor at UN Women and Chair of the Board of the Reykjavik Global Forum of Women Leaders. Thank you, and over to you, Deanne and Hannah.